Thank you, Dr. Pandya, and to Preeti for arranging this seminar. Good evening to everyone in India, and good afternoon to those joining us from Israel and elsewhere. Israel was the first state in the region to recognize Mao's China in 1950, a gesture only reciprocated by Beijing's acknowledgement of Jerusalem in 1992. Arafat's PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, opened a representative office in Beijing 1965, which in 1984 was raised to a full embassy status. In the intervening years, China supplied weaponry to Palestinian militants through the ports of Latakia, Alexandria, and Basra. Ba'athist Iraq and Syria, as well as Nasserist Egypt, radical Arab regimes whose anti-colonial socialist orientation dovetailed with revolutionary China, were anxious to demonstrate its anti-Western hostility, dressed as solidarity with decolonized regimes, thus bolstering its credentials in the Islamic world. The Palestinians, like other Arabs, steadfastly held to a one China policy, especially after the PRC, People's Republic of China, entered the UN and permanent seat at the Security Council in 1971 and the expulsion of Taiwan. Besides the PLO, other more extremist Palestinian groups too, like George Habash's PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, notorious through the 1960s and 70s for worldwide hijackings and airport bombings, was supplied weaponry and maintained representatives in Beijing. Fatah fighters routinely traveled to China to receive military training from the PLA, People's Liberation Army. Palestinians, for their part, were chary of upsetting Mao following the late 50s Sino-Soviet split and veered more towards Beijing than Moscow. Chinese confrontational diplomacy was geared towards challenging not just the imperialist powers, but also Moscow, which did not, at that point, recognize the PLA. Stalin's USSR, you will recall, like Truman's USA, readily recognized Israel's creation on the afternoon of 14th May 1948. China was deeply involved in the near unraveling of Jordan following that Black September 1970 uprising, when Palestinian militias almost succeeded in overthrowing the Hashemites. A certain Brigadier Zia-ul-Haq, on secondment to the Jordanian military, saved King Hussein's skin. Mao's China, during its extreme leftist phase since its 1949 founding, was then in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, and supported the Palestinians even when other Arab states were not in favor of the Jordanian monarchy being toppled. China was deeply engaged in the Jordanian civil war between the army and those Palestinian militants based in Jordan. The latter's arsenal was entirely China supplied. Beijing was unusually vociferous globally in attacking personally the late King Hussein, the Jordanian monarchy, army and state at various fora and in the media. Black September Palestinian terrorists who murdered Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Beijing through the 70s, following détente between Washington and Moscow, blamed both powers for sponsoring regional hostilities and defending Israel's right to exist. This not only bolstered Beijing's credentials as a revolutionary voice in the Afro-Asian world, but also played to domestic sentiments given its own Uyghur and Hui Muslims. Lebanon, like Jordan, was ravaged by two wars with Israel in 1978 and 1982. The government during both conflicts suffered thanks to locally entrenched Palestinian militias stoking that 1975 to 1990 civil war, which nearly destroyed Lebanon. Sino-Lebanese relations only improved after Beijing acceded to Beirut's request to halt shipments of arms to Palestinians. Beijing adopted a pragmatic stance following Deng Xiaoping's assumption of office in 1978. After realizing trade, but particularly military ties could be cultivated in the region with conservative regional monarchies who were generally pro-Western and against the godlessness of Marxist regimes, whether Moscow or Beijing. China supported the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference following the Gulf War I, which led to realizing Israeli achievements in defense and agricultural technology. China came to conclude that it could procure military know-how from Israel, which had enviable access to American arms and technology as no other country. China rapidly realized Israel was unable to oblige, but this has not dented bilateral technology transfers and scientific collaboration. This 21st century Sino-Israeli relationship puts in the shade Beijing's trade and hydrocarbon ties with all countries in the Middle East. Sino-Israeli partnering did not prevent China from recognizing Hamas following its 2006 electoral victory. China displays no objection to dealing with Islamists, whether Hamas representatives or those of the Muslim Brotherhood in the short-lived administration of Egyptian Prime Minister Mohamed Morsi. Not that any of these Sunni extremist groups have publicly condemned the anti-Islamic indoctrination, internment, rape and torture of fellow Sunni Uyghurs. Inasmuch as China, like India, did not historically have a legacy of anti-Semitism, this contemporary outburst of bigotry is evinced now in conspiratorial, left, ultranationalist domains of Chinese cyberspace. Tropes of decidedly European inspiration, hitherto alien to the Sinitic worldview, now frequently circulate alleging COVID-19 was a Judeo-American complot or that Jews universally engender pandemics, global financial crises, and wars. It is a sobering reminder how anti-Israeli positioning inevitably blurs into outright anti-Semitism and is not a monopoly of the alt-right, but flourishes in liberal progressive circles and leftist circles within Western academics, socialist or green parties, celebrities, social influencers, and leftist media outlets. I have, as a historian, outlined Sino-Palestinian relations. In bringing the past to bear on the present, I posit the following remarks in conclusion. The PRC has and does enjoy positive relations with the Muslim Middle East, Arab, Iranian, Turkish, as well as Israel. It is a major trading partner of all the aforementioned. Commerce drives, dictates, and determines the Chinese worldview of the Middle East. Ideally, it would prefer this most conflict-racked region of the world, with simmering ancient hatreds and rivalries, were not in the situation it is perennially. Israel versus Gaza, Iran versus Saudi Arabia versus UAE versus Yemen, Qatar versus the GCC, and last but by no means the least, Iran versus Turkey, who jockey for political leverage, Islamic prestige, and settling scores through proxies to determine geostrategic outcomes in the region. Both Iran and Turkey, note, are nation states compared to these artificial Arab entities created only during the last century. China pulled off earlier this year something of diplomatic coup by brokering a resumption of relations between Tehran and Riyadh. It is arguable that Beijing can wield some influence over Tehran, perhaps not so much as it admittedly can with Islamabad, for instance. But those who propose that China can moderate Iran to dial down the tension or stay Hezbollah's hand from unraveling the region further miss pointing out this salient feature of the Chinese, namely their instinctive reticence to walk the talk. Beijing steadfastly eschews being sucked into inter- and intra-regional rivalries. It is not interventionist and can offer nothing towards any solution in the Middle East now or ever. And this is not just the Middle East or the current Palestinian imbroglio. Beijing, as a rule, is wary of being sucked into the domestic or regional politics of other regions too, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Pacific, which do not have a direct bearing on its strategic interests and assets. Thank you very much.